Well, the strategy is what we call the 4 pillars, and it's science, mitigation, adaptation, and communication. A lot of people sort of want to focus on the difference between mitigation and adaptation. When we think about mitigation, that means we would actually make a change in reducing the carbon footprint, which is sometimes easier said than done. Adaptation is when we look at reducing vulnerability, and that's where maybe we can have a better outcome, but not necessarily. So it's a slippery slope. I think this idea of breaking down silos, this is a term that may sound odd, but we're using it a lot in the National Park Service. It has to do with not operating in a vacuum. We tend to, or we have in the past, for instance, in the Southeast, in our regional office, we have facilities, we have cultural resources, we have natural resources, and of course we have, all the others like IT and human resources and all that. But the 3 biggies that sort of work, sometimes maybe even in opposition, are facilities, cultural resources, and natural resources, and we don't always communicate. So we're trying, and then even within our division, we have history, I'm in cultural landscapes, we have archaeology, which is actually archaeology for the Southeast region is in a whole nother state. That's down in Tallahassee. So sometimes even within a division, we don't always communicate well, and that certainly is true interdivisionally. So we're really looking at being more communicating better, having better collaboration, and let's all come to the table and talk about some of these issues sort of more holistically. We have to have intergovernmental communication. I mean, I will say, I think for climate change, we're maybe doing a better job because 2 of our, I would say, main partners are NOAA and USGS, who were 2 agencies mentioned in 2 of the earlier interviews. And they are, I would say NOAA and USGS, in my mind, from a science standpoint, are sort of the leads, 2 of the lead agencies. So I think our communication interagency is maybe sometimes even better, actually, than it is even within the service, because I think when you get to that point, people do get the bigger picture. They really realize, okay, this is happening, and if we don't adapt, if we don't look at vulnerability, this is, if we don't plan, if we don't think ahead, then we're really going to come up short, and that's what we don't want to have happen. Well, when we talk about cultural resources, we're talking about buildings and structures. For instance, we're in Charleston. We think about all the amazing historic buildings in Charleston. But what about cultural landscapes? In Charleston, you have a lot of beautiful small gardens, but a cultural landscape can be a battlefield. It could be a vernacular landscape. How about a Gullah Geechee landscape? And then we have all the ethnographic resources, which is another huge area, which would include Gullah Geechee. We talked earlier in the program about fisheries and historic fishing communities. That's ethnographic. Typically when people think about ethnographic, they think about American Indians, our tribes, and Native peoples, but it's far bigger than that. And then we have museum collections. So it's a very broad range of resources. Well, I guess you just have to break it down. I mean, that's the only thing I can think of, is you sort of break it down. What we're trying to do in the Park Service is take each park and do a vulnerability assessment. Where the science side is also, every park is having an inundation study done for sea level rise. I believe every park is also doing a vulnerability assessment, not for sea level rise, but for individual species, both mammals and vegetation. So we're trying to, I think, break it down into more manageable pieces so that we can maybe at the end we can put together a strategy that will work. That's a big one. That's a big one. Funding from Congress. But I will say, even though for some congressional members it may not be, it may be more of a hard sell, I do think that things are changing a little bit. I think that people are finally grasping that we're not just talking about rise in temperature, that when we talk about climate change, we're talking about drought, erosion, storm events, and of course sea level rise. But I think that we are reaching a larger audience, and it's, we have to continue to educate. But I do think we're beginning to make progress that people in Congress, and we have many, the Park Service has actually been rather fortunate that we actually have members across on both sides of the aisle who have been very supportive of the National Park Service. And so now that climate change is a big part of our strategy, I have to remain positive that we'll get those congressional dollars. Well, first of all, just to clarify, in my particular job, I'm dealing with internal Park Service. However, that doesn't mean we don't encounter resistance. We do. I think it's getting better, but I have actually heard people in coastal parks say, losing our marshes, that's not going to happen. We're not, but I think, but I've seen less resistance. As time is going on, I don't really hear those kinds of responses as much as we used to. Yes, we know there will be loss. That's what I mean by vulnerability assessments. We're looking at, first of all, trying to make sure we have a record, an inventory of all of our resources. And then we're looking at significance and vulnerability assessments because we know there is going to be loss and we have to be ready for that. I mean, we don't have the answers yet, but in doing vulnerability assessments, we can maybe hope that we can make better choices if we have to make those hard choices.